In 1947, the Soviet Union unveiled its brand new strategic bomber. And it was an American plane. Not inspired by one. Not based on one. An exact bolt-by-bolt copy of the B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced bomber on Earth. The very aircraft America had refused again and again to let Stalin have. The United States never sold it, never shared it, never lost a single blueprint. And yet there it was, flying over Moscow with red stars on its wings. How? The answer begins with 3 American bombers that fell out of the sky at exactly the wrong place. And a dictator who understood something Washington didn't. You don't need to steal the drawings if you can steal the plane. What followed was the greatest reverse engineering operation in history. Over 100,000 parts measured one by one. An entire national industry rebuilt around a foreign machine. And engineers so terrified of their own leader that they copied the bomber's patches and flaws along with its genius. America refused to give Stalin its best bomber, so Stalin simply took one and ordered his engineers to build a mirror. This is the story of the Tupolev. During World War II, America gave Stalin almost everything. Under Lend-Lease, $11 billion in aid flowed east, hundreds of thousands of trucks, 12,000 armored vehicles, and more than 11,000 aircraft, fighters, transports, even some older bombers. Whatever kept the Soviets fighting Hitler, Washington shipped. But one item was refused every single time Stalin asked: the B-29 Superfortress. And Stalin asked repeatedly. He knew exactly what it was. A machine a full generation beyond anything else flying. Pressurized cabins, computer-controlled gun turrets, the range to cross continents with 10 tons of bombs. The best Soviet heavy bomber of the day still had fabric-covered control surfaces. The B-29 was an aluminum spaceship by comparison. America was willing to arm Stalin against Hitler with almost anything, except the one aircraft that could someday reach America itself. Roosevelt understood that this wasn't a weapon for this war. It was a weapon for the next one. So the door stayed shut, until the sky itself opened it. In 1944, American B-29s were hammering Japan from bases deep in Asia, long, brutal missions at the very edge of their range. Crews had standing instructions. If your aircraft is too damaged to make it home, divert to the nearest friendly territory. And on the map, that meant the Soviet Union. Here's the twist almost nobody remembers. The Soviet Union was not at war with Japan. Moscow and Tokyo had a neutrality pact. So, when 3 battle-damaged B-29s came limping into Soviet territory near Vladivostok that year, international law gave Stalin a gift-wrapped excuse. A neutral country is obligated to intern warplanes and crews that land on its soil. The airmen were eventually allowed to slip home. The bombers were not. Just like that, without a single spy, without stealing one page of blueprints, Stalin was holding 3 flyable examples of the most advanced bomber on Earth. America had guarded the B-29's secrets from Soviet spies for years. And then the fortune of war simply parked 3 of them on Stalin's doorstep. One would be torn apart. One would fly. One would sit untouched as the sacred reference standard. Then Stalin summoned his best designer and gave him the most suffocating order in aviation history. The man given the job was Andrei Tupolev, a legend of Soviet aviation and a man who knew exactly what failure meant. Years earlier, Stalin's regime had arrested him on absurd charges and locked him in a prison design bureau. He had designed aircraft as an inmate. Now Stalin handed him the B-29, canceled Tupolev's own bomber project, and gave him roughly 2 years, with the secret police standing behind the deadline. Tupolev, at one point, suggested improvements. The reply attributed to Stalin has become legend. Don't make it better. Copy it. Exactly. And so, terror became an engineering methodology. According to an engineer who worked beside him, Tupolev was so afraid of Stalin and his secret police chief Beria that he ordered every trivial detail duplicated, so no one could ever accuse him of deviating. The stories grew from there, that repair patches on the fuselage were faithfully copied, that even battle damage and a forgotten typewriter were reproduced. Some of those tales are exaggerated, but they grew from a real seed. In Stalin's Soviet Union, it was safer to copy a flaw than to explain an improvement. The Tu-4 wasn't just built from American parts, it was built from fear, where copying a mistake was safer than correcting one. But here's what the legends miss. Copying that plane was one of the hardest things Soviet industry ever did. Sneer at the word copy all you want, then try to actually do it. Tupolev's team dismantled the B-29 into more than 105,000 individual parts, measuring each one and producing some 40,000 technical drawings. And immediately, they hit a wall nobody in Moscow had predicted. America built in inches, the Soviet Union built in metric. The B-29's aluminum skin came in thicknesses that simply did not exist in Soviet mills. So entire factories had to retool. By some estimates, over 90% of the bomber's components had no Soviet equivalent at all. The alloys, the plastics, the rubber, the electronics. The gun turrets alone were controlled by analog computers that calculated speed, gravity, temperature, and humidity, technology the Soviets had never manufactured. To copy one aircraft, Stalin effectively forced his entire industrial base to leap a generation in 3 years. And the result was astonishing. When the first Tu-4 was finished, it weighed just 340 kilograms more than an original B-29, a difference of less than 1%. Stalin didn't just steal a bomber. He used it as a crowbar to drag the whole of Soviet industry into the American age. Now all that remained was to show it to the world. August 3rd, 1947. Aviation Day at Tushino Airfield, Moscow. Western observers watched as 3 giant bombers thundered overhead, unmistakably B-29s, wearing red stars. At first, the Americans in the crowd relaxed. Of course, those must be the 3 interned bombers from 1944, repainted for the parade. Embarrassing, but harmless. And then a 4th aircraft appeared, the same fuselage, rebuilt as a passenger liner. 4 airframes, when Stalin had only ever captured 3 flyable planes. In one heartbeat, every Western observer at Tushino understood the truth. The Soviets weren't flying America's bombers. They were building their own. It took a 4th silhouette in the sky over Moscow for America to realize its greatest bomber had just been mass-produced by its greatest enemy. The implications landed like ice water. Nearly 1,000 Tu-4s would eventually roll off the lines. In 1951, one of them dropped the Soviet Union's first air-delivered atomic bomb. The same design that had carried the bomb to Hiroshima now carried Stalin's. Its range against America was marginal, one-way missions at best. But for the first time, U.S. cities had to take the possibility seriously, and a vast air defense buildup followed. The Tu-4's own career was surprisingly short. By the mid-1950s, jet bombers were taking its place. But the story didn't end in Russia. In 1953, Stalin gifted 10 Tu-4s to China, and China refused to let them die. Chinese engineers re-engined them with turboprops, and in 1969, even mounted a giant rotating radar dish on one, trying to turn the old bomber into their first flying radar station. The last Chinese Tu-4 wasn't retired until 1988, an American design from 1942, still flying under a red flag more than 4 decades later. The stolen copy of America's bomber outlived nearly every original. the last one flew for China until 1988. And its deepest legacy was invisible. The factories, the alloys, the methods that copying it had forced into existence became the foundation on which the next generation of genuinely Soviet bombers was built. So, that's the greatest theft in aviation history. A theft with no burglar, no spy, no stolen blueprint. America guarded its bomber flawlessly and lost it anyway, to a neutrality law and 3 emergency landings. To be fair to the engineers of the Tu-4, what they pulled off was staggering. Copying a machine you don't understand, in measurements you don't use, under a deadline enforced by secret police, may be harder than inventing one. But the lesson cuts deeper. You can refuse to sell your best technology, you can guard the factories and lock away the drawings, and war will still find a way to hand it to your enemy. And once they've learned what your machine has to teach, you can never take that knowledge back. And Stalin wasn't done collecting. 2 years after the Tu-4 flew, Soviet jet fighters were tearing through Korean skies, powered by a British engine that Britain had politely sold to Moscow on a promise not to copy it. That unbelievable blunder is the next story we're telling. Stick around.